Have you ever stopped to think that the conflict between Israel and Palestine is not just political, but carries spiritual and prophetic roots that go back to the days of Abraham? That's right, while the modern world usually explains this war through borders, treaties, and diplomacy, the truth is that it was born from a divine promise. And here's the controversy. Perhaps the origin of this hatred is not found in UN maps, nor in resolutions about occupation, but in something much older, a dispute of identity that began within the same family. It sounds counterintuitive, but think with me, how can two nations that descend from the same father, Abraham, become mortal enemies? The answer lies in promises, prophecies, and beliefs that have shaped centuries of history. What we see today in Jerusalem, in wars, and even in failed peace attempts was already, in a way, written in the pages of the Bible. It's as if every bomb, every protest, and every political act were chapters of a spiritual narrative pointing to the end times. And the reward for those who dive into this story is clear. To understand not only the present conflict, but also how it connects to your own life and faith. Because, at the end of the day, what is at stake is not just territory or power, but the fulfillment of a divine promise that still echoes today. Since ancient times, when Abraham heard the divine voice calling him to leave his homeland, a promise was born that still echoes today. God assured him that he would give a land to his descendants, an inheritance that went beyond a mere physical territory. For the people of Israel, this promise was not just about borders, but about spiritual identity, hope, and trust in something greater than the visible. Imagine Abraham walking through deserts, with no map and no human guarantee, sustained only by the divine word. That faith in the midst of uncertainty is what shaped the notion of an eternal promise. And it's interesting to see how, even today, many are inspired by this courage to face personal battles, whether in searching for a job, caring for their family, or pursuing dreams that seem unreachable. When we talk about Israel and Palestine, we cannot ignore that the foundation of this modern conflict goes back to that ancestral covenant. What began as a spiritual alliance also became a political, territorial, and historical dispute. The promise, which should have united through faith, ended up dividing peoples who claim the same root. It's curious to think that this narrative, recorded in Genesis, carries such great force that it has outlasted millennia. Abraham, Isaac, and their descendants were not just distant characters, but pieces of a story that continues unfolding before our eyes. Thus, the land of Israel is not seen as a mere choice, but as something directly tied to God's plan. And this is exactly where the thread begins for the next stage of this journey. If Abraham received the promise, how did his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, end up creating two lineages that to this day dispute the same legacy? When Abraham received the promise, it seemed obvious that it would be fulfilled simply. But the story took an unexpected turn with the birth of Ishmael, son of Hagar, and later Isaac, son of Sarah. From there, two lineages emerged that still carry not only memories, but deep marks on the identity of Israel and Palestine. Each of them claims legitimacy, and this creates an echo that still resonates in current discussions about territory and spiritual heritage. Isaac was seen as the son of the divine promise, the one through whom the covenant would be established. Ishmael, though not rejected by God, was considered the ancestor of the Arab nations. Here lies the root of the conflict, two families sharing the same father but following different paths. It's like those family situations where siblings fight over an inheritance, each one believing they have absolute right to what the father left. From this separation, the dispute ceased to be only about blood or genealogy, it also became a spiritual battle. Jews saw in Isaac the link to the divine promise, while the descendants of Ishmael saw in him the legitimate continuation of the blessing. This duality created a scenario where faith, intertwined with history, turned into fuel for conflict. It's impressive how this division still echoes today. When we talk about war, occupation, or even Jerusalem, it's not just politics at stake but centuries of memory and prophecy. For those observing from the outside, understanding this root can help to see the conflict with more depth, like a puzzle where each piece has its emotional and spiritual weight. And it is exactly this spiritual tension between lineages that leads us to reflect. How did this internal conflict between children of the promise and children of the flesh turn into a true spiritual war that spans centuries? Throughout history, the rivalry between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael gained an even deeper layer, the spiritual. Many see the conflict between Israel and Palestine not just as a territorial dispute, but as a spiritual war that spans millennia. For some, it is a struggle between the children of the promise and the children of the flesh, an invisible battle manifesting in wars, occupations, and failed negotiations. This idea of spiritual conflict helps explain why there are no easy solutions. It's not like a simple border agreement, but a matter of identity. For the descendants of Isaac, the divine promise is non-negotiable. For the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's blessing also belongs to them. It's like two people disputing the same key, each believing it opens the door to their own home. Interestingly, for many Christians, this struggle is interpreted as part of biblical prophecies. They see in every war, in every territorial advance or retreat, a sign of the times, a fulfillment of ancient words pointing to the end times. And for the modern observer, this brings the sense that the conflict is beyond politics. It's almost like watching a play written thousands of years ago. This spiritual perception is not limited to sacred texts. It influences political decisions, stirs deep emotions, and fuels the identity of both Israelis and Palestinians. For many, fighting for the land is also fighting for the soul, for honor, and for the bond with the divine promise. And it is precisely this spiritual weight that makes every battle even more painful and symbolic. And when we think about land, we cannot forget. After all, what land was promised to Abraham and his descendants? The answer leads us to expand our vision to the dimension of the promised land, something that goes beyond modern borders. When we speak of the promised land, the Bible describes a vast territory, from Egypt to the Euphrates. This delimitation goes far beyond the borders of modern Israel, expanding the scope of the divine promise. For the people of Israel, this vision was not just geographical, but carried spiritual weight, as if each grain of sand were a reminder of God's faithfulness. And for the descendants of Ishmael, this promise is also a cause of dispute, as they too claim the right to that land. It's fascinating how a territory, in theory marked by invisible lines, still generates such intense conflicts today. Just imagine two neighbors fighting over a backyard, but on infinitely larger proportions, where every stone and every river become symbols of identity. The biblical map turned into a political, religious, and military argument, used by both sides as proof of legitimacy. This promise of land was always seen as something prophetic, pointing not only to physical possession, but also to the preservation of faith. Many believe that inhabiting this region is, in fact, living the fulfillment of a divine promise. Hence the insistence on not giving up certain territories, even if the price is war, occupation, or the sacrifice of entire generations. And what is most intriguing is that this territorial question has crossed centuries without losing strength. While some see their only political disputes, others interpret them as spiritual signs connected to the prophecies of the end times. Thus, every war, every failed peace agreement, and every strategic move are seen as chapters of a greater story. And it was precisely at this intersection between promise and reality that, in 1948, a new chapter arose, the foundation of the modern state of Israel, which reignited tensions and began a new phase of history. After centuries of diaspora, persecutions, and especially after the devastating trauma of the Holocaust, the Jewish people intensified their cry for a national homeland. It was in this context that, in 1948, Israel declared its independence, rekindling ancient promises and deeply shaking the reality of Palestine. The UN at the time had proposed the division of the territory into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. However, for many Palestinians, this partition was perceived as injustice and betrayal. The creation of the State of Israel was not just a political act, but also carried a spiritual and prophetic aura. Many Christians saw in that moment the fulfillment of ancient promises, the return of a people to the land promised to them. For the Arab Palestinians, however, it was the beginning of a period of suffering, marked by displacement and the loss of entire villages. This duality turned the year 1948 into a milestone that still divides opinions and emotions. It's curious to note how an act of independence, which in other nations could mean only celebration, here immediately generated war. The day after the declaration, neighboring Arab countries united against the newborn state. This detail shows how the history of Israel and Palestine is unique. Nothing happens in isolation, everything reverberates beyond its borders. The birth of modern Israel also brought new layers to the conflict. On one side, the divine promise seemed to manifest itself in the return of the Jewish people. On the other, Palestine faced an imminent Nakba, a national catastrophe that uprooted thousands of families. This contrast is one of the keys to understanding the emotional weight this subject still carries today. And from this foundation, tensions did not cease. On the contrary, they intensified and gave rise to the first great Arab-Israeli war, where Israel's victory would completely change the course of the region. The day after Israel's declaration of independence, the war began. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded the young state, believing they could defeat it in a few days. But history took another course. Israel not only resisted but expanded its territory beyond what the UN had proposed. This outcome surprised the world and left deep marks on Palestine, which experienced the Nakba, the catastrophe that still echoes in the hearts of its people. This war was more than battles in fields and cities. It symbolized the collision between spiritual promises and political realities. For the Jews, it was the victory of a people who, after centuries of persecution, finally had a homeland. For the Palestinians, it was the beginning of mass exile, with families forced to leave their homes, villages destroyed, and memories erased by force. It is impossible not to feel the human weight of this conflict. Imagine waking up and suddenly losing everything you built, your house, your work, the land of your ancestors. That is exactly what happened to more than 700,000 Palestinians. At the same time in Israel, crowds celebrated the fulfillment of a promise they believed was written since the days of Abraham. Two completely opposite views of the same event. The War of 1948 also revealed something curious. How could a newly formed people without a consolidated army resist and win against several united nations? Many see in this a divine intervention, while others explain it through strategy, international support, and the determination of the fighters. This mix of faith and pragmatism is a trait that still accompanies Israel today. And the most striking fact is that the end of the war did not bring peace. On the contrary, it inaugurated an open wound in the Palestinian identity, the Nakba, a collective trauma that still shapes discourses, memories, and claims. For the Palestinian people, 1948 was not just the foundation of Israel, but the beginning of a national tragedy called Nakba, the catastrophe. More than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes, never to return. Entire villages disappeared from the map, and memories once shared around family tables turned into stories of loss and pain. To this day, the term Nakba carries not only memories but also an identity marked by resistance. This collective trauma shaped the Palestinian narrative and became the core of their struggle for justice. Many keep the keys to houses that no longer exist as symbols of the right of return. This simple gesture shows how occupation and displacement were not only political but spiritual, touching the soul of a people. The Nakba became the link between generations, as if each child inherited not only a surname but also the memory of a lost home. It is impossible to understand the Israel-Palestine conflict without recognizing this emotional weight. For every celebration in Israel, there were tears in thousands of Palestinian families. And this duality created a deep abyss that no UN resolution could fill. While Israel spoke of divine promise and prophetic return, Palestine spoke of injustice, occupation, and denied rights. In many refugee camps even today, the Nakba is remembered in songs, poems, and annual commemorations. Not as a distant memory but as a living wound. And for those observing from outside, it is striking how history did not stay in the past. It continues to influence politics, culture, and even prophecies related to the end times. And in the heart of this pain, an even more delicate point arises: Jerusalem. A city that became the spiritual epicenter of the conflict, revered by three religions and disputed as if it were the very heart of the divine promise. Jerusalem is more than a city, it is a spiritual symbol that spans millennia. For the Jews, it is the eternal capital, the place of Solomon's temple and of the divine presence. For Christians, it is the stage of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the center of the faith that changed the course of humanity. For Muslims, it is the city where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven, housing the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. This convergence of meanings makes Jerusalem an explosive territory, disputed not only with weapons but with prayers. The curious thing is that, on any political map, Jerusalem looks like a small city with no major natural riches. Still, its importance transcends the material. Whoever controls Jerusalem believes they hold a spiritual key as well. It's as if every stone of the old streets carried the memories of kings, prophets, and divine promises. This dimension makes the city the true epicenter of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Israel, controlling Jerusalem means fulfilling prophecies and consolidating its national identity. For the Palestinians, it means resisting occupation and keeping alive the connection with their roots. That's why the dispute for the city is not only political, it's existential. It's like a heart beating for two bodies at the same time, each claiming to be the rightful owner of that beat. It is also in Jerusalem that the world turns its eyes with every new clash. News of demonstrations, attacks, or negotiations involving the city gain immediate repercussion. And it is no coincidence. Understanding Jerusalem is understanding the gravitational center of the conflict, where religion, politics, and prophecy intertwine in a unique way. And it was precisely this centrality that became even more evident in 1967, when Israel, during the Six-Day War, conquered East Jerusalem, an event many see as prophetic fulfillment. In June 1967, the Middle East was shaken by a lightning conflict, the Six-Day War. Israel, surrounded by growing tensions, decided to launch a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The result was surprising. In less than a week it conquered Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Sinai, and the Golan Heights. This victory not only redrew the map of the region but also reinforced the sense that something prophetic was happening before the world's eyes. For the Israelis, regaining East Jerusalem was like touching a divine promise dormant for centuries. The scene of Jewish soldiers crying at the Western Wall became a historical landmark, interpreted by many as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. For the Palestinians, however, it meant deepened occupation, further loss of territory, and the strengthening of a wound that had been bleeding since the Nakba of 1948. The Six-Day War also exposed the fragility of the region. Arab countries, though numerous, could not stop Israel's advance. This disparity gave the conflict a spiritual tone. Some interpreted it as divine intervention, while others saw it as the result of military strategy and Western support. Either way, the fact is that Israel emerged from the war stronger and with greater territorial control. But this victory came at a price. For the Palestinians, each new conquest by Israel was a painful reminder of occupation. Families found themselves trapped in controlled territories, with limited rights and under constant tension. The conflict made it clear that peace was not near. On the contrary, the wounds were even deeper. And it was in this scenario of conquests and occupations that the UN stepped in with the famous Resolution 242, trying to bring order to a situation that seemed beyond human control. After the Six-Day War, the UN Security Council approved Resolution 242 in November 1967. The goal was simple on paper but complex in practice: to call for Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories and ensure mutual recognition among the states in the region. The ambiguity of the text, however, opened space for different interpretations, fueling debates that remain alive to this day. Israel saw in the resolution an invitation to dialogue, but not an obligation to fully return all conquered areas. The Arab countries, on the other hand, interpreted it as a clear demand for total withdrawal. This difference in reading turned the resolution into a kind of political puzzle, where each side used the same words to defend opposing interests. The curious thing is that, despite so many discussions, Resolution 242 continues to be a reference in almost all peace attempts that followed. It's like a cornerstone that no one can remove, but that never fits perfectly. It became a symbol of the complexity of the conflict, showing that even words written on paper carry the weight of promises, wars, and occupations. Many scholars point out that this ambiguity was intentional, as a way of leaving space for future negotiations. But in practice, it ended up creating frustrations and irreconcilable expectations. For Palestinians, it meant hope of return. For Israel, it meant room for maneuver. And in the midst of that, the reality on the ground remained one of checkpoints, refugees, and territorial disputes. And while diplomats tried to solve on paper what seemed unsolvable, a much older and more powerful movement was already shaping the destiny of Israel and Palestine: Zionism. Zionism was born in the 19th century, in the midst of a Europe marked by persecution and anti-Semitism. The idea was clear: to create a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, where their spiritual and historical roots were planted. For many Jews, the movement was more than political, it was almost prophetic: the return to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Thus, Israel would not be just a refuge against oppression, but the fulfillment of a divine promise. Leaders like Theodor Herzl turned this dream into a real project. He argued that the survival of the Jewish people depended on a state of their own, where they would no longer be foreigners in someone else's land. This vision mobilized thousands who began migrating to Palestine even during the Ottoman Empire, reigniting both hopes and tensions with the local Arabs. Zionism also became a diverse movement. There were religious currents, which saw the return as the direct fulfillment of prophecies, and secular currents, which saw only a practical need for survival. This diversity gave strength to the project but also created internal debates about what the identity of the future state of Israel should be. For the Arab Palestinians, Zionism was seen as a threat. While the Jews celebrated the dream of return, the Palestinians saw the beginning of the loss of their land. This duality shows how the same idea can be a source of hope for some and pain for others, shaping the identity of both peoples. And at the heart of this debate, Jerusalem became even more central. After all, the city was not only the destination of Jewish pilgrims but also housed one of the holiest places in Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. For Muslims, Jerusalem is not just a historical city but a point of direct connection with the divine. At the heart of the city, the Al-Aqsa Mosque plays a central role. It is considered the third holiest site in Islam, right after Mecca and Medina. According to Islamic tradition, it was from there that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night of ascension. This spiritual detail makes Al-Aqsa not just a temple, but a symbol of faith and resistance. For Palestinians, Al-Aqsa goes far beyond religion. It is identity, a flag, and a bond with their land. Every time there is a threat of invasion or restriction of access, the response is immediate because it is not just a building at stake, but an entire collective memory. It's as if each stone of the place carried the struggle of generations, reinforcing the feeling that occupation also strikes at the spiritual heart of Palestine. Israel, in turn, sees the area as part of its historical heritage, especially because in the same space once stood Solomon's temple. This overlap of meanings creates a tension almost impossible to resolve. After all, how can you divide a space that, for both sides, is sacred and non-negotiable? This is one of the reasons why Jerusalem remains the epicenter of the conflict. What is impressive is how Al-Aqsa has also become a stage for political disputes. Every clash in the mosque's courtyard reverberates globally, mobilizing countries, religious leaders, and even the United Nations. The issue stops being local and becomes international, showing how spirituality and geopolitics walk together in this region. And we cannot forget, behind this struggle, there is also a prophetic dimension. Many associate the events in Jerusalem and in Al-Aqsa with biblical prophecies that speak of the end times, which leads us to the next point. Many look at the conflict between Israel and Palestine and see only politics, but for others, each event is part of a prophetic gear. Texts from Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation are often cited as predictions of wars, sieges, and even the return of the Jews to their land. The famous Valley of Dry Bones, described in Ezekiel 37, is interpreted as an announcement of Israel's resurrection after centuries of dispersion. For those who read with this spiritual lens, current history seems like a script written thousands of years ago. This view gives the conflict a dimension that goes beyond borders. Each new war, each broken agreement, or even each attack in Jerusalem is read as a sign of the times. For Christians who follow the prophecies, Israel is not just a modern country but God's clock marking the last days. This thought awakens both hope and fear, as it points to the fulfillment of the end times. Many believe that the control of Jerusalem and the return of the Jews to their land already represent fulfilled stages. And this belief even influences international politics. Governments, religious leaders, and even popular movements support Israel or Palestine not only based on geopolitical interests but also on prophetic convictions. This prophetic perspective, however, is not unanimous. While some see clear signs in the scriptures, others believe these are just forced interpretations to justify political positions. But regardless of opinion, one cannot deny that the Bible continues to shape how millions of people understand the conflict. And it is precisely in this scenario that the strong influence of the evangelical Christian perspective arises, which sees Israel as a fundamental piece for the end times to be fulfilled. Among evangelicals, there is a strong conviction. Israel must exist so that the biblical prophecies about the end times can be fulfilled. This view did not emerge yesterday. It has been nurtured for centuries through the reading of scriptures, especially books like Daniel, Zechariah, and Revelation. For many, supporting Israel is not merely a political choice, but a spiritual mission, almost as if cooperating with God's own plan. This perspective makes millions of Christians around the world see in the return of the Jews to the Promised Land a clear sign of the closeness of the end. They interpret wars, occupations, and even the founding of Israel in 1948 as prophetic milestones. For these believers, each new conflict in Jerusalem is more than a news headline. It is a page of scripture being lived in real time. Curiously, this stance also influences government policies. Many leaders, especially in countries with Protestant traditions, support Israel precisely because of this religious basis. It's not just about geopolitics, but about a spiritual reading of the international scene. This detail shows how faith and politics intertwine in a powerful way. Of course, not all Christians share this view. Some consider the prophetic interpretation to be exaggerated, often used to justify political alliances. Even so, It is undeniable the weight the evangelical perspective carries in relations between Israel and the Western world. And looking back, we realize that this connection between faith and politics did not begin now. Since the time of British colonialism, promises and declarations were already planting the seeds of what we would see later, as in the famous Balfour Declaration of 1917. At the height of colonialism in 1917, Britain issued the famous Balfour Declaration, promising support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For many, this document was like lighting a flame that was already latent. On one side, Jews saw in it the opportunity to make the Zionist dream concrete. On the other, local Arabs perceived betrayal, since the British had also promised support to Arab aspirations during World War I. This British double game became one of the central points of discord. At the same time it encouraged Jewish immigration, it also tried to maintain Arab support. It was like trying to hold two ropes being pulled in opposite directions. This ambiguous policy planted seeds of distrust that would later grow into decades of conflict. The Balfour Declaration was not just a diplomatic decision, but also carried spiritual weight. Many Jews interpreted it as a sign that the divine promise was beginning to be fulfilled. Palestinians, however, saw their land being promised to others, fueling a sense of injustice that added to the pains that would come later. This episode shows how political decisions can intertwine with prophecies and identities. What for some was hope, for others was occupation. And to this day, the Balfour Declaration is remembered in speeches, both as a milestone of achievement and as a symbol of betrayal. And it was precisely this accumulation of promises, occupations, and frustrations that later turned into popular uprisings. The Intifadas, expressions of Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation. The Intifadas, a word that means uprisings in Arabic, were explosions of popular resistance against Israeli occupation. The first took place between 1987 and 1993, when Palestinians, weary of blockades and restrictions, picked up stones and turned streets into battlefields. The second, between 2000 and 2005, was even more intense, marked by suicide attacks, military repression, and thousands of deaths on both sides. These revolts showed that the conflict was not just in offices or UN maps, but pulsed in the veins of ordinary people. Curiously, the Intifadas were not planned by political leaders but were born from the indignation of the people. Young people, women, and even children became protagonists in an unequal struggle, where stones faced tanks. This image spread around the world, reinforcing the Palestinian narrative of resistance against a much greater power. For Israel, however, it was a security challenge that demanded harsh responses. These uprisings reveal how occupation is not just a territorial issue but affects daily life. Checkpoints, demolished houses, and movement restrictions created a cauldron of frustration. The Intifadas were, therefore, the clearest expression that Palestine did not accept the imposed situation, and that there was a cry trapped in the heart of its people. But it is also important to remember that the Intifadas left deep scars. Many lives were lost, the economy was destroyed, and mistrust between peoples intensified. Even so, for Palestinians, they symbolize courage and dignity in the face of occupation, while for Israel, they represent threat and instability. And within this scenario of confrontations and tensions, one issue remains alive: the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, seen as the fulfillment of a divine promise by some and as a violation of rights by others. The presence of Jewish settlements in the West Bank is one of the most sensitive points of the conflict. For many religious Israelis, living in this land is directly fulfilling the divine promise made to Abraham. It is not just about houses built on hills, but a spiritual and prophetic act. For Palestinians, however, these settlements represent occupation and expulsion, a daily reminder that their lands continue to be taken little by little. International law classifies these settlements as illegal, but Israel sees them as part of its security and biblical heritage. This duality creates an impasse. On one side there are Jewish families who believe they are obeying a sacred command. On the other there are Palestinians who find themselves surrounded, prevented from cultivating their land or expanding their cities. It is as if two different stories were being written on the same soil, each one erasing the lines of the other. This scenario generates not only political tensions but also daily conflicts. Clashes between settlers and Palestinians, destruction of crops, and blockades are frequent. For those who live there, it is not a theoretical discussion. It is the reality of routine marked by fear, resistance, and resentment. And beyond the physical dispute, there is also the spiritual one. The settlements are used as proof of prophecy fulfilled for some, and as proof of injustice for others. This overlap of meanings makes each inhabited hill a symbol of faith, struggle, or loss, depending on the perspective of the observer. And faced with this so conflicting reality, several peace attempts emerged over the decades: Oslo, Camp David, among others, all with the difficult mission of trying to reconcile divine promises, human rights, and political interests. Over the past decades, several negotiation tables were set up with the goal of ending the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Oslo in 1993 brought hope that finally there would be a path to peace. Palestinians and Israelis sat together, signed agreements, and for a brief moment, the world believed war would give way to coexistence. However, the initial enthusiasm quickly turned into frustration, as many crucial points remained untouched. Camp David in 2000 was another remarkable attempt. There, the destiny of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and the delimitation of borders were discussed more directly. But, as expected, these topics proved almost impossible to reconcile. Jerusalem, especially, remained an insurmountable obstacle, since neither side accepted giving up its spiritual and historical sovereignty over the city. These agreements revealed a pattern. Mutual trust was fragile and promises were rarely fulfilled. For Palestinians, it seemed that negotiations only strengthened occupation. For Israelis, each concession was seen as a threat to national security. The result was always the same: initial hope followed by disillusionment. Even so, one cannot ignore the importance of these meetings. They showed that there is a desire for peace, but also that the issue is much deeper than simple political treaties. The conflict involves identity, memory, faith, and even prophecies. That's why each failure made even clearer that technical solutions would not suffice without a spiritual and social transformation. And it is precisely at this point that the UN continues to appear as a mediator, trying to offer solutions that look good on paper, but face enormous challenges in practice. Even before the foundation of Israel in 1948, the UN was already involved in the conflict, proposing the famous partition plan for Palestine. Over the decades, the organization continued to act as mediator, approving resolutions, imposing ceasefires, and creating investigation commissions. In theory, its role was peacekeeping. In practice, each decision became the target of criticism, sometimes accused of favoring Israel, other times accused of leaning toward the Palestinian side. Resolutions such as 242 and 338 tried to outline paths for peaceful coexistence. However, their application always stumbled on the lack of consensus. Israel feared that giving up territories would compromise its security. Palestinians saw the decisions as insufficient to repair the injustices suffered since the Nakba. Thus, the UN became a stage of fiery speeches, where each side sought to legitimize its narrative before the world. It is interesting to note how, despite criticism, no one ignores the UN. Palestinians constantly appeal to the organization for recognition and rights, while Israel, even if it disagrees with many resolutions, also uses the space to defend its position. It is like a referee in a game where both teams distrust impartiality, but neither accepts leaving the field. The UN's role also extends to humanitarian aid, especially in refugee camps. Agencies such as UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, became essential for millions of displaced Palestinians. However, even this aid is the target of political disputes and criticism, reinforcing how nothing in this conflict is simple. And at the center of so many resolutions, criticisms, and failed attempts, one even more sensitive issue emerges: human rights constantly violated by both sides amid bombings, occupations, and attacks. When we think of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, it is impossible not to touch on the wound of human rights. On one side, there are reports of occupation, blockades, forced evictions, and deaths of Palestinian civilians. On the other, there are terrorist attacks, rockets launched against Israeli cities, and a population living under constant threat. The human drama is so profound that it often gets lost amid political and spiritual analyses, but it is the harshest reality for those who live there. International organizations frequently denounce abuses committed by both sides. Entire families are struck by bombings, children grow up among sirens and walls, and the hope of normal days always seems postponed. For Palestinians, checkpoints and the siege of Gaza have become symbols of oppression. For Israelis, each attack is a reminder that their survival is at risk. Both carry visible and invisible scars. The curious thing is that, even in the midst of so much suffering, faith continues to be the fuel of resistance. Many Palestinians see their struggle as a defense of their dignity and identity, while Israelis interpret their perseverance as the fulfillment of the divine promise. This intertwining of faith and pain turns each violation into another chapter of a larger narrative. But despite the denunciations, the international community seems unable to offer definitive solutions. The issue drags on in meetings, reports, and protests, without concrete change for those living in refugee camps or in cities under attack. It is as if the whole world were watching, but no one could intervene effectively. And it is precisely because of this combination of human suffering, spirituality, and politics that this conflict continues to be so unique and so complex. A story that began with Abraham and still echoes in our days, pointing to prophecies and to the expectation of the end times. After walking through this long journey, from Abraham to the present day, it becomes clear that the conflict between Israel and Palestine is not only about land, but about identity, promise, and prophecies that span centuries. And now I ask you, how will you look at this conflict from now on? Will you see only news of war, or will you be able to perceive the spiritual and prophetic dimension behind each event? Think about it. If a promise made thousands of years ago still influences the world today, what does that say about the power of faith in the Word of God? And more, could it be that your own life also carries promises that need to be recovered and fulfilled? This reflection can transform the way you face your daily challenges. The invitation is simple: don't let this knowledge be just information. Use it as inspiration to strengthen your faith, value your spiritual identity, and see beyond what human eyes can see. Because, in the end, the greatest battlefield may be within ourselves. And if you want to keep learning about these deep biblical stories and discover how they connect with today, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. That way you won't miss any content and you'll continue with me on this journey of wisdom and revelations.